Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Very exciting NSE today. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 674th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, the Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Sarah Sense and Yasmeen Siddiqui. We are also thrilled to welcome poet Molly McGlennen here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize that land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place and of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the soul and land that we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Sarah Sense is from Sacramento, California. Sense has been practicing photo weaving with traditional basket techniques from her Chitimacha and Choctaw family since 2004. While director and curator of the American Indian Community House Gallery in New York, Sarah Sense catalogued the gallery's 30-year history, which inspired her search for Indigenous art internationally. Guiding editor and writer Yasmeen Siddiqui is the founding director of Minerva Projects. Her practice is an overarching commitment to testing perceptions of either specific artists or existing art movements through the synchronized interplay of writing and exhibition making. Siddiqui has published numerous articles and essays and has received multiple awards. Her work with artists has been recognized by the New York-based Independent Curators International and the Andy Warhol Foundation. And it is with great pleasure that I will pass it over to you, Yasmeen, to get us started. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Eleanor. Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure and a delight and an honor to be kind of stewarding this conversation. I'm extremely grateful to the Brooklyn Rail for having engaged me, as it brought me in, and for many reasons. So I recently saw, of course, the show is brilliant. It's actually really powerful. And I'm not one to overstate or gush, but the work was really surprising. And in so many ways, I implore anyone who can to go to Bruce Silverstein, the gallery, and see the work, because while Sarah will kind of hone in and offer us images of her work before it's framed, before it's set behind plexi that kind of creates a barrier between our experience of the work, I think there's something to be gained from seeing it in person, of course, naturally. So thank you, and let's begin. So Eleanor, if you want to share the slides, the way I'm organizing, or I've decided to organize this conversation, is around 5 questions. And Sarah will respond to those, and images will come forward to help dig in a little deeper into those elements. But and then, of course, the part I adore is the audience participation. So it'll be so interesting to hear what each of you has in mind, and just pop those questions into the chat. Eleanor will make sure that they are read and addressed. So before I have a very specific question to Sarah, to launch to Sarah, for her to share her insights into with all of you, I want to preface this, that, and it's just my obsession, is that I am so committed to, in a kind of quiet way, the allowance for hybrid identities to be articulated. And so I want to put that forward now, and it's for a whole host of reasons that I don't need to ramble on about. But that underpins everything I'm curious about in her practice. So Sarah, thank you so much for allowing me to ask these questions. Too obtuse. So step one. So I have 5 here. I'd like to begin with your reflections on the ways weaving prints of photos, film stills, and maps. The maps is that's why everyone needs to go see the show, because it's the play of maps that's really surprising, that how those have influenced your contemplation of multi-layered cultural and ethnic identities.
Thank you, Brooklyn Rail, for having me and for everyone who's come to share this conversation. Thank you, Yasmeen, for the really thoughtful questions. Admittedly, I don't always like to look too much at questions before interviews. Otherwise, I feel like my answers are too structured. So there's times when I might ask you to repeat. And thank you for all of the compliments on the show. I just want to say I'm so grateful to Bruce Silverstein and all of the gallery for putting together such a lovely exhibition and for inviting me to be there. And it's been such a thrilling experience. And I'm really happy to be able to talk about it with different curators, and today to talk about it with Brooklyn Rail. I think that the best way to answer your question would be to look at the chronology of my work. And I think that the layers would definitely come from these different moments of my weaving practice, beginning with landscapes of the Chitimacha Reservation. And when I arrived at that concept of weaving photographs in 2004, while I was living in New York, it was very much about dealing with my efforts to reconnect with my Chitimacha community, despite family traumas, family ruptures, changes within the dynamics of our family. And finally, in my adolescent years, going back there with my mom and reconnecting. And then furthering that, what I think a lot of people don't know about my work, because I don't put it into statements and things, because it feels like a more business side of it. But the scholarship program that I was enrolled in was a payback program. So for every dollar that I was given for my education, I had to go back and do community service. And that was such a brilliant idea, coming from the council and then from the scholarship program, because all of us students who were receiving any kind of money from our community for school, we had to very directly go back and engage with community. And so it became this extra layer of our education. And for me, very quickly, after doing all sorts of different community service, it was about the kids. And I did community youth programming, and that sort of connection that I had, and that journey of that connection, was very much about me going back to the reservation, me hearing stories about my grandfather that weren't always, cheerful, and having to sort of understand my coping mechanisms with that, but also my connectivity to that, and then my relationship to that land, which is still our ancestral land. So originally, when I began weaving, it was about that landscape. It was about what the reservation looked like in 2004. The next layer, very quickly after that, was me questioning my own identity within that community and within a Native American community, or the Native community in North America. And for me, I had to go back to just these really general, sort of stereotypical ideas that had played out in front of me my whole life with, you know, Hollywood and fashion, and how Native, these sort of like ideas of the cowboy and Indian were constantly, you know, being played out on television and film, and cartoons. And so playing with that duality, but looking at it as like, you know, not just the cowboy, but the cowgirl, and not just the Indian, but the Indian princess. So that would be the next layer. After that, I think looking at those, I should say that then is the personas, the cowgirl and the Indian princess. And the first time I photographed myself acting out those personas was in 2004. I then started collecting images. And so a lot of these posters were from Sunset Boulevard in LA, Burbank, and then on East 8th Street around NYU. When I lived in the Village, I would, you know, walk through there, as a lot of us college students, I think, did. And there was a lot of like costume and sort of like play, you know, just sort of like playful fashion. And I was able to put together my Indian princess costume. And all of it was fake, and that was very purposeful. And I was then also collecting the posters, and that was the beginning of my collecting. And I want to say, for those two personas, which I think directly relate to my grandmothers, my grandma Chile is Choctaw, my grandma Rita is Texan, as she says. So they're both collectors themselves, and they both come from very, I would call them survivors. They come from very like rough marriages. They both had, one had 6 kids, the other had 5. They had to work. They were nurses. They were in bad relationships. They lived in a time where it wasn't okay to have a divorce. And they still somehow managed to raise, you know, their children. And I think there was a lot of like, you know, trauma that's been passed down. So I know that sounds really personal, but I think it's really relevant to these like personas. And so then you have the other layer of the collecting. Grandma Chile was a basket collector. Grandma Rita was a collector of like Americana. She had an antique store when she finished nursing. And so I would often go antiquing with her and find things with her in those antique stores and whatnot in Los Angeles. So those layers are all present in this Power Lines body of work. And the last layer is going to be the maps, like you said. When I was still living in England, I was a part of a symposium called Beyond the Spectacle. And I had been there for 5 years, and I didn't really find a Native community to be a part of. And it was hard because it was so much, felt really distant to be weaving and to be making this work and just keep like shipping it to the United States. Like there was definitely like a disconnect. And when Beyond the Spectacle put together this programming and invited me to be a panelist, I just started to meet other people, including members of the British Library. And one, Abraham Phillip, approached me and said, I think you should consider applying for a fellowship at the British Library. Our new director of the Eccles Center, I think, would be very willing and excited to have an artist like you do a fellowship. And he's thinking differently. He's not going to just, you know, have sort of like scholars doing the fellowship. So it was like a different approach to what they normally would have done. And that same day, I'd heard Cole Thresh, author of Indigenous London, give a talk about his book and his work. And I just felt very excited and energized by his concepts and his research. And so I very quickly, between Philip and Cole, I was like, yeah, I'd love to do that research. But I think I really would, and Cole knows this, and he's so like generous with me and kind with me with his research and his work. I really had to lean a lot on Cole and his work on what Indigenous things were brought back to London from North America. And that's the beginning of the maps.
Okay, wow. Okay, so Sarah, you offered up a lot.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, oh my gosh, no, this is as it should be. As it should be. Otherwise, we can't formulate interesting like questions in our imagination about what it is that's happening. So there are a couple of words that you put out there that really struck me. So step one, antiquing, the idea of you and your grandmother antiquing. So I want to go dig into this, antiquing, collecting, and then before we go to question two, so antiquing, collecting, I want to look at those terms, and then Cole Thrush and that relationship, and in some granular detail, what that relationship allowed you to find. That is so, at least for me, as very like a new observer, a new witness to your practice. I can sense it, but I can't put my finger on it. So step one, antiquing and collecting with your grandmother Rita, right? Is that
Yes.
it? So
yes.
Okay, so then how was this place and its material culture and its objects and all of that, how did you even decide what to look for and what to hold on to and what to, bring into her space?
Sure. I think, and this is I think a really good example of being faced with something in your life and then going back to what it felt like when you were a child or when you were an adolescent, and going back to it as an adult with all of these other experiences. And I think that's I think that's just a part of life, right? Like if I knew then what I know now kinds of ideas. So when I go back and imagine, like, my grandma Rita is still alive. So I can still go to that same house where she lives now, is where my father grew up. I have a lot of memories there, and it's full, it's full of antiques. It's full of old furniture. I even know like what pieces of furniture she's going to give to me when she passes on. And she's given me, things my whole life, like these little like collections, like little things like glass and stuff, and silver. And it's just always been a part of my life. Whereas my grandma Chili, her house was so different. Like her collections, and in her second marriage, she married a geologist. So her house was more decorated with like rocks and baskets, like a lot of baskets. And she was also an artist. So then her drawings and her paintings. And so it was very like, they're two totally different styles, but they're also, there were these little collections all over the two homes. And now as an adult, I can see how impactful that's been on my life. As far as going out and finding things, like I love auction houses. When I lived in England, my husband introduced me to auction houses. It would be fair to say it caused some fights, because I would buy so much stuff. Like we would have to get moving trucks to go and like collect all of this furniture and these things. And they just like, they energized me. They were so exciting and different. And it was like, these words like early Victorian, and they weren't selling. And I'd be like, 20 pounds, I'll take it. Like, so in those, again, like those objects, like I get very curious about the drawers, like what's inside of the drawers? What are the stickers? Where was this made? And now being in California, we did ship the majority of those things back. Admittedly, they're still in like offsite storage, but I love them. Like they have like all of their own stories, and I don't know what those stories are per se, because they belong to somebody else. But I think that
you can impose or find stories in them.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of the thrill for me of like antiquing, or like going out and like finding little treasures that, you know, become really, you know, they are very inexpensive, but they've really been like loved and looked after, and I don't know, it feels special to me. And then basket collecting also feels, I mean, that feels totally different, because I think I've just been thinking a lot about, especially in the last week, and then when I was doing power lines, thinking so much about like the patterns and how long those patterns have been made, and how, you know, like those numerical sequences, like I'm counting in English numbers to make patterns, and like I wonder what the words that were being repeated and what it sounded like for somebody else, you know, in my bloodline, to be like repeating sounds to create a pattern, and what that feels like, and the feeling that I have when I'm weaving, and trying to like really embrace that feeling and that concept of like blood memory and continuation and continuity.
That's very powerful, actually, that idea. And I could see in down the road an exhibition with your baskets that are kind of abstracted and framed and hung against purpose, you know, on the wall. And that you know, whatever is going on in your mind as you contemplate numbers and pattern, that's an extremely powerful idea. So now I do all the, oh shoot, we forgot Cole Thrush, but we can get to him later. We can get to him later, because I don't want to lose sight of like a couple of little elements that I really I want to understand better. So you'd mentioned your use of the cowgirl and the Indian princess archetypes, these archetypes, which is extremely powerful and super, you know, kind of quietly arranged, or somehow the form you've developed with the weave weirdly both like articulates and amplifies, but quiets all of these references. And I don't, I haven't got my head around exactly how it works. But so from in a like historical, from a historical standpoint, in your practice and in your perspective, how do these two archetypes sit within these archives that you've been, the thrush thing kind of dovetails in here, but let's stick with Hollywood archives, and also in a very kind of basic way, not basic actually, in your thinking about federal legislation of Native status. So I'm personally very interested in the way governments and negotiate and representatives negotiate identity. So that's where this comes from. It's my own little thing. But within your own work, you have these archetypes which provoke further questions about, yeah, so how would you ideally want these archetypes to sit within these archives, the Hollywood and the feds, the thing?
Right. So it's almost like, in the most generic terms, sort of like the real and the fake, right? So everybody is going to be able, and most people are going to be able to look at like a cowgirl and Indian princess, and maybe they can't pick up on, like in this image here, like obviously that's a fake Indian princess image. That's like a very like white European looking woman who is naked, like holding a towel just over her chest with a feather in her hair, smiling. And it's like, it's a sex image, right? It's a pinup girl. And then the cowgirl then also has like other like sexual implications. And then she has what I call her tool rather than her weapon. And the guns coming up in the work for me are about just like the Americana and sort of the presence of guns that in my life and my family's life. Some of these pieces, you can see what I call our young and impressionable photos of my sister and I shooting guns with my grandma Rita's second husband. Her husband, Grandpa Buell, who I call my Grandpa Buell, was a gun safety instructor. So he was very passionate about making sure that we understood what guns were and how to use them safely. It's just a part of my upbringing. It's part of my childhood experience. And we have photos of it. And those photos I call young and impressionable. And they're in, there's parts of them in this Powerline series. So that's like a very real experience, shooting a gun at 7 years old, holding a gun as a cowgirl and pointing it at a pinup Indian princess poster is like a more like fake experience. Again, I know I'm like taking all of those things that you said so beautifully, and I'm like shaking it out to like a very simple duality.
No, you're not. You actually, I'm going to interject here. You actually struck a real chord in my head, because what you just said was, I think bringing attention to what can potentially be empower. So much of what's going on in your work disrupts whatever anyone's going to bring to it in our contemporary, society. And in the general, I don't want to generalize, but in general, among contemporary art folk, they're going to, so to speak to what is empowering actually about learning how to shoot a gun, that's extreme, and to juxtapose it with something where something is reduced is really powerful. And it's really interesting, and being responsible, that your grandfather taught you in a responsible way to shoot, and what that means. I think
I want to respond to that with a thought before it goes any deeper, and I lose my focus.
Yeah,
if that's okay. Sorry.
Of course.
I think talking about those that the simplifying the duality, let's say, and the fake and the real, and like the real life experience versus like the experience that we have when we watch something on TV or look at imagery versus lived experience, right? And I think with the last question, then going back to the maps, I want to focus on one part of this image here.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to circle back to what you said about Native status and what's going on with government. And I would use, the word assimilation and assimilating Native peoples after genocide, after stealing land, after removal. And then on top of that, the next layer then being this sort of like pop culture furthering that agenda of assimilation. Is that okay if I screen share right now? So I'm going to pull up the image first and let me see if I can make this big so that so we can make sure it's really like focused and interesting. Okay. Let's see, did that work?
Almost, yeah.
Okay, so here is, so this is a poster that I found in LA, and it's of Ronald Reagan, and he is pulling a woman toward him, and she's pushing her head back and pulling away. And so you can see her face here, and you can see her breast here, and then her waist. And I put along this body, the silhouette part of the Mississippi River. And if you look at the whole piece up here, you can see the man like leaning into her and pulling her close. And then this image, I've used this image before, and I feel like when I finished this piece, this was one of those moments where I felt like surprised by how much I liked how that came across. I liked how much that came across, like having the river and the female body like so closely intertwined. And I think that is where the fake and the real intersect. That is where, you know, I think it's a really like tricky zone of letting like film and fashion and all of these things like come into our lives just by watching them or exposing ourselves to them. And then, you know, taking that a step further to then letting these people that are, you know, playing out in film and in television, then becoming the politicians, then becoming those people who are making big decisions for our nation, and a nation that's already been built on all of these other difficult like histories that were constantly like hiding, or constantly, you know, not making any sort of like effort to bring into the classrooms. I can say for public schools. And now that I have school age children, I'm very like curious about what they're teaching, and I volunteer in the classrooms and I see what they're teaching, and it's very skirted over and, you know, kindergarten and first grade, which is where we're at now. So I'm going to undo my screen share now. Okay.
Sarah, you, with such elegance, you like made my kind of base curious question about the relationship of the Hollywood archives and legislation. You so clear to me. And I'm curious to know from the audience if those two elements came into play, and what is one element of what's happening in your work that allows for the fake and the real to kind of push up against each other. Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you. So to that point, like, so after your description of what it is to look very closely at where you're from, where your grandparents, your parents, and where you're rooted, and having this hint, we will return in time to Cole Thrush in a moment. But because I'm really curious, like that sounds like an amazing way, like expansion, like a way in. Because archives are so difficult to navigate in general, and you need someone to help you find what's there for a whole host of reasons. Anyway, but before we go there, so you, as you said, you're in Sacramento, so you're from and live in California, but still you've traveled widely all over the planet to deepen your understanding of weaving traditions. Mm-hmm. So what I'm curious about is what connects and what differentiates all of the traditions you've come to know, and step one, and then do they surface, or how do they surface in your own work?
Okay. I feel like I feel like I have to answer that in 3 different ways. So I'm going to start with the thing that feels most relevant right now, only because I've just done a trip in the Southwest, and I'm going to use quotes to say Southwest, because in a panel that I was on at the Tucson Art Museum, we were talking about like definitions of the Southwest and what does that mean, and how do you define the Southwest? Are they federal borders? Are they state borders? Is it a Hollywood idea or ideal? And that was the first part of my trip, like Phoenix, Tucson, and then I went to Santa Fe, and then Denver, Colorado. And there was this sort of like theme through that 1 week trip with that began in Tucson and ended in Denver. So when I went to the show, I think it's called Reimagining Identity at the Tucson Art Museum, and they opened the show and I walked in with the curator and she was showing me my piece. And I had forgotten that she did what she called a cultural pairing. And there was one room of all Indigenous women artists whose work was paired with an object that was traditional. And I think this isn't a new concept. It's not a new idea, but the way that it was women in this one room and the way that all of the women whose contemporary Native art was being shown were all living artists. And it was so beautifully done. And I walked up to my piece and there is a huge example of a double weave Chitimacha basket. I don't know if you can see my hands, but it was like quite big, lidded, from the 1930s. And it sometimes when I see these baskets for the first time, it's a very emotional moment for me. And in that moment, you know, there were people all around in the gallery looking at different work, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't, just because people are around, it does not like intimate experience, like of that one-to-one experience, like Chitimacha, beautifully looked after, double weave lidded basket with a pattern that I've woven before, right next to my work. And it was from the 1930s. And, you know, of course, right away, I wanted to know who wove the basket. And the end of my road trip is in Denver, and I stayed with my aunt and uncle. And my uncle Paul has a basket from my great grandmother, Delphine Stouff. And Delphine was the last medicine woman, and she was a weaver. And we were able to, like, I got to hold the basket, and it's a basket that was in my grandma's collection that it's always been there. And it was like, I just knew, and Paul and I talked about it, but like we started looking at just dates, and I really think Delphine wove that basket that's in Tucson. And it was like just a really emotional experience. And so when you see something behind plexi that you can't touch and you can't feel, but it's like family, and then to, you know, end this little like road trip journey that I was on with like going to sleep with this basket, like it's so real. That's like the most real experience. I don't remember the rest of the answers to the question. I'm sorry.
No, that is the most beautiful statement.
Traveling the world.
But that is the world. The world is as big and small, you know what I mean? From Sacramento to Denver is, in this day and age, as close and far as Sacramento to Tokyo, really. So, you know, yeah. It's you know, we live in a different time than Delphine, you know, where travel's just fundamentally and our concept of things. Right. So that's that.
I think that and that's it, that concept of time and life, and how does, I mean, now these are like spiritual questions, and there's no like, you know,
there's a lot, you know what you know what you just said. So I'll go back to the questions because I don't want to derail and go into my own little obsessions, but very much all the conversations about restitution of objects. I mean, you really pointed out you've expressed so clearly the power of an object, of the material, only insofar as it holds work, the hand, memory, reference. It's not an abstraction. It's not, it's not a tool for a class. And so the image of you sleeping next to this basket is very powerful. So thank you for being so forthcoming, actually.
It's a very, it's so recent, like it was just this week. And then things that happened like in between. And I could have flown from Tucson to Denver, but I knew I just knew I had to drive. Like I knew that I wanted to drive. I knew that it was going to be some kind of a journey. And actually like all these little things that happened, in between Tucson and Denver it was just a wonderful experience. And it was also, I don't get to have that very often because I have 3 young kids and a husband, and to be alone traveling on the road by myself, I was open to having those experiences, and I feel like they're really important.
And you were able to observe closely how the range of how the context shift, how the landscape between those 2 points transforms, at every hundreds of miles. And that's important in terms of our conception of self, in terms of our conception of how we represent our relationship on earth in time. And I feel that in a lot of your work. So because I think, sorry, yeah.
I just want to say, in relationship to what you've just said, and going back to the original parts of the question and like the traveling, very specifically, the travel that I did for Weaving the Americas, when it was, once I flew to Guatemala City, and then I took buses all the way to Santiago. And again, that journey, it was really important that I wasn't flying around, that I was on the road, that I was on the land. And like you said, like having that visual experience of the land, having the ability to stop and take a photograph, to stop and meet Indigenous artists, to learn about the work, to really understand like where a community is situated within the land, and then how those materials and resources within that land where the community is then of course a part of the food and the art. And I think that was a really, probably for me, the most important realization from that journey was seeing how intimately connected the human land relationship was, and how that is what that art that was being made was about.
Yeah. Yes, that I sense so deeply. And of course you take that working, that system for engagement, and like you kind of in this, like dropping a stone in water, and it just ripples out and out and out and out across the whole planet, because you've been traveling far and wide. But I think the travel is like all of the journeys, aside from perhaps the Americas, because you were on ground, but everything else is anyway. So I think that's very powerful. And it also makes me wonder, so you had the guidance of Cole Thrush into the archives. So before our last question, I'm curious to know, had you already developed your understanding of the map and the way you wanted to explore mapping before Thrush took you into those archives?
I think that my time at the British Library was certainly the first time that I really found myself like engaging in a maps room. And I spent several weeks there, and I ended up in that space because of sort of the directions that Cole put me in. When I had finished another symposium in 2019 with Beyond the Spectacle in Norwich, he was going to the British Library with his class, who was in London from Vancouver, I think Vancouver. And he invited me to come and be in that class. And the then director of the Eccles Center was there, Phil Hatfield, and Cole and I. And he gave me the same handout that all of the class had gotten, that was about different objects that lived in the library. And we started talking about maps, and we started talking about Philip Abraham and I had already been talking about sort of the like how many maps of America there were of the 1700s, because that was a time where there was, so many wars being fought and so much claiming of land and pushing out of people. And these are all like historical things that weren't necessarily on my radar, because I don't have a scholarly historical background. And so I do have to lean on scholars for that information. And I really lean on them for the writing too. And I just want to say two other scholars who have been influential to me, Caroline Wigginton, who just came out with a new book this week, Indigenuity, and very generously put me on the cover of the book. And we've had a lot of conversations about just ideas in that book and how it related to what I was doing with the British Library. And so those, like my conversations with Caroline, even though she didn't say, look at this object and look at this, like just having that really open conversation with a mind that has accessed so many different so much literature about American crafting. She's actually taken Choctaw language classes. She has, and is looking at the relationship to the words, to objects, to feelings, to color, and being able to, talk with her about those things. Like it inspires so many ideas. Lisa Brooks, I got to hear her give a keynote and at the University of Oregon while I was there doing another panel, and the way she talked about the Northeast and like coyotes, and how the coyotes are always present, and rather there being like a fear of an animal, sort of like having a love and admiration for their ability to adapt to anything. And so I think that I was very surprised to learn that there were Native and non-Native scholars in these very scholarly circles in the United States that were writing about and dealing with indigeneity and decolonizing and crafting and language. And it just it's so inspiring to me. And anytime I have an opportunity to communicate with these scholars is, it's like a real treat for me. And it gives me so many ideas. So.
And I know you give them ideas. I mean, your interpolation of so much that is floating in the universe, organized or chaotic, is really remarkable. And yeah, Lisa Brooks, for sure. I'm very interested in this region. I'm in the Hudson Valley, and her analysis, her research is remarkable. So to the last question, because I know everyone has to leave. So of course, a title is always important. So how did you come to this title, Power Lines? It's so precise and charged. It provides a frame for the work that's so particular and specific. Could you speak a little bit to that before we open it to the universe?
Sure. And I think it goes back to when I started on the archive search for this project for power lines, it came at the very beginning, I think, before I, got into the maps room at the library. And just talking with people at the library about like Phil and Philip, and I think Cole was there too at this moment. And we were talking about like the maps of the 1700s. And when you look at these, some of these maps, like some maps are very, it's art, like it's very delicate. The calligraphy is very beautiful. The drawings in the corners, like the forts, everything's it's very beautiful, even though like the meaning of the map or the purpose of the map is usually war. It's done in a very like delicate, beautiful way, but some are just like lines, like here's the line, this is Louisiana, and this is New France, and this is New England, and like this is ours, and here's how we're going to take it. And that's where I'm going to do another screen share, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I'm going to pull up here. This is a good example. Am I screen sharing?
Nope, not yet. It might be coming soon.
Am I sharing now?
It's almost, it's, yes.
Okay, so here, like the text, that calligraphy that you can see going through the piece, this is from manuscripts that were at the library. And some of these were letters to Queen Anne, some were like registration, like kind of like rolls, or like one piece is called Trade and Navigation. So it's, it's about moving things around, people, goods, like just that, like how much movement was happening in this time of like, while like claiming lands and pushing people out, but also like introducing new things, and also introducing people, like all of the enslaved that had to come and, do the labor. So I think that the word power lines comes from like specifically those maps, and looking at, I'm going to stop the share, looking at the maps and from the 1700s and the federal lines, the state lines. When I started to work with the maps and the things, COVID had come. I had my third baby here in California, and I was in just like a very like raw emotional space, like maybe a bit fragile, like a lot of people in the world. And can we go to the next image, please? Is that okay? And I think that we had, I don't know, the lines meant something different to me. And I was able to spend more time like meditating on that, like those ideas of lines. And I did a piece for an installation commission for Florida State University. And as I was, for the first time putting the maps together, after like all the sadness of like all of these shows being canceled and feeling like my career was over for 2 years. And then all of a sudden Florida State very kindly came to me, and they were like, we have this grant money and we have to spend it right now. Like, can we buy you supplies? Like I got a new computer, I got all these new supplies, I got money to make new work. And I was like, I'm going to make you like huge work. Like the work was so big, we didn't even know how to ship it, but I had so much fun making it. And I got to come out of this like sad space. Yeah. And then I was like, the lines like were about blood, and it was about, and it was about blood memory, and it was the veins, and it was the roots, and it was the trees. And those lines are it's that like that connectivity of like, like if you can visualize, like I can visualize my veins going into the earth the same way a tree would. And that's power lines. That's the real power.
That's beautiful, Sarah. Yeah, that's a really astounding comment and reflection and commitment. Thank you so much for indulging my curiosities. And
job.
I know well, I don't know, but I can guess that there are a bazillion very eager people who would love to ask questions. So I'll leave this in the hands of Eleanor, Master of the Universe. And thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Yasmeen.
Yasmeen.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This has been an incredibly rich conversation. I'm just a lot to think about. So thank you. We do have some great questions here from the audience. Our first question will be from our friend GE. GE, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, Yasmeen, and of course, Sarah. Question is, do you feel, what do you really feel perhaps are the challenges, both technically and culturally, of modernizing traditional forms of expression? We could call them artworks, but maybe they're more ritual objects, etc. Because it almost seems as though there's this like wonderful sort of futurism that's going on with your work that just really excites us. Thank you.
Sure. I think that's a good question, and it's a really common question. I'm going to grab my basket that I have right here because I think looking at a basket as like a tactile thing that can carry stuff, rather than looking at this as like, although there are ceremonial objects in here, so maybe like there's the catch-22. But the basket can do so many things. It has so much purpose, right? And I think this is holding like little baby moccasins that were made for my firstborn. This is a ceremonial like cup that was given to me in Canada. I had a friend bring me down some cedar to sort of like smudge my family once after like some hard times. So, and a gift that was made for me when I went to Oregon. So yeah, these are all like very special, like beautiful things that I keep in my basket. So it's holding memory, it's holding ceremony. It's all things that I love and that were gifts. And I think that maybe that's the same thing when I'm weaving. Like the history is that my great grandmother was weaving and that my grandfather did not, and then my mother did not, and then I felt this purpose to weave again, like that. So now the weaving becomes about a journey of reconnection, of healing, of moving through trauma. And I think that that's sort of the hard part. And that's the part that feels like, when I said in the beginning, like the part that feels sort of dramatic, that may have been before the whole audience was invited in, but like sometimes it does feel like there's a drama playing out in the studio. And I think that what that drama is me coping with decades of trauma. And it can feel really crippling sometimes. It can make me like stop. Like there's some images that I'm working on in my studio where, I do a print, I set the whole print up to cut it, and then I leave it for weeks because I don't understand it, and I don't understand how to deal with those concepts, and I don't want to be misunderstood. And I don't want, like, particularly, I don't want the sex to be misunderstood. I don't want the spiritual aspects to be misunderstood. And I think that those are two things that are going on in Indigenous art right now that have to be talked about and have to be written about by Native people because they're present. And we have to talk about it and write about it so that other, scholars can understand it. There's a really wonderful exhibition that I just got to see that I'm a part of in Denver called Indigenous Feminism. And if you can look at it online, or I posted photos on my Instagram that have, it's women who are, I think, very specifically dealing with trauma and sex and, those things that are, it was like the perfect context for my work and for so many of the other artists' work.
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for that wonderful question, GE. Our next question is from Chloe. Chloe, you should be good to go.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Yasmeen. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. My question is, Sarah, your works incorporate photography that is archival and really think about the photo as an object in terms of reweaving as well as reconsidering history. I'm wondering how your work has shaped the way you approach archives and the practice of archiving and how it's shaped your relationship to photography, both digital and analog.
Thank you. Have a good. I can say that just as as a photographer and as a weaver, that I feel like I'm at a point in my career where I am now doing everything. So I'm doing the image collecting, which I've always done, and then the Photoshop and the printing and the cutting. And then my husband and I are together doing the framing and the grading and the shipping. I mean, that's where we need somebody to do the shipping part, but we organize all of it. And having having control of every single element, it feels really good to be at that place in my journey as an artist, because I think there were so many years where I had to kind of hand over files to a printer to print, or hand work over to a framer to frame, and always being like, are you using archival tape or is it glue? And what kind of paper are you printing on? And I think that and I feel giggly about it too, because it's but it's also very nerve-wracking experience, and you're trying to be an artist and you're super poor and you're trying to do everything correct. And I just I'm really happy to know every material that is a part of my work now, and I'm glad to be at that point in my career. That feels really good. And it also took a long time for me to figure out how to work in an archive. And I was, there's some things that I'm really good at and some things I'm really bad at. And there was something about going and looking at digital archives online that don't make sense to me. And I have to have a lot of help. And it really just doesn't work. But as soon as someone explains it correctly, and then then I can really get locked in and get in a very nice, get in there good. But the physical part of it, of ordering the map, and at the British Library, you put your map order in and then it comes to you quite quickly. And so, yeah, just the same way that I would handle my own photography, handling the map and looking at it and the tactileness of it. So yeah, good question.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chloe. What a great question. I would love to ask a question to you, Sarah.
Okay.
I love how your work literally weaves together images and also words, sort of what Chloe was mentioning. And I was wondering if you could expand on the way that written work is a part of your practice and how you're influenced by words, and whether they're archival or more contemporary in your practice.
More personal writing would come from my grandma Chili, and then from my own writing, and then bringing in other texts. I think the first time I brought in a lot of text to my work would have been with the Choctaw Irish relation. And that was for an exhibition that was going to be in Tucson near Broken Bow, where my grandma is from, my grandma Chili. And, we didn't really discuss how she was going to be a part of the show. I think it was one of those, we didn't have to talk about it. She just prepared all of these memoirs for me and all of this writing and gave me the writing, and she knew I had the show, and I did an audio recording of her speaking, and that became a part of the show. And she passed away while I was doing the work. And so all of a sudden that audio recording became something different. It became a memory of her voice. And it's really, like, for me, it's really powerful. And the text, like, of her stories. Last night I was at my parents' house, and I had just been with my mom's brother, Paul, in Denver. And she said, I'm sorry I couldn't come. I really wish I could have been there. And I said, it actually was probably better that you weren't there, because that's the first time I was alone with my aunt and uncle, with Paul and Cheryl. And we really were able to talk about stuff. And we were like, like I said, we were looking at the years and listing we were listing the siblings from the two families, from the Choctaw family and the Chitimacha family, and going deeper and deeper into like family stuff. And I said this to my mom last night, and I asked her a question about her grandparents. And before that, I prefaced it with, I said, it's okay, but I feel like when I ask you questions about family, the conversation changes very quickly. And I said, and that's okay. I understand why. And I don't want you to think I'm saying that's a problem, but that's, it's kind of like, that's what happens. And that's, so it was good that I was alone with Paul. And then so then I said something about the grandparents, and the conversation changed like in seconds. And I sort of was like, that's exactly it. And the look on my dad's face was, he's so protective of my mom, but he was sort of like, how dare you bring that up in her life? So it's the trauma, and it's like, how do you access the trauma? How do you access family without evoking traumatic memory? And that grandma writing all of these stories down and giving them to me, gave me so much access. And so that's the first time the text came in. And the really traumatic stories are written behind the paper. They're woven through, they're covered up. You can't see them, you can't read them. Other stories about her brother accidentally cutting off her finger, you can read because it's funny, and it gives you a little bit of insight into what it was like to live in Oklahoma on a farm as a kid, and World War II era. So I think there's the fun, and then there's the trauma, and how do we access that in a safe way without making people feel uncomfortable? Does that answer your question?
Definitely, yes.
Okay.
That was a great response. Our next and final question will be from Fong Bui, and my colleague Raven will be asking on his behalf.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. So I'm asking on Fong's behalf. Are you able to speak to the unique geometries that are woven into the works?
Yes. So when I did 3 residencies at the Banff Center, and I don't know if anybody else in this crowd has done a Banff Center residency, but it's in Banff, Alberta, Canada. And there's 3 schools there. It's art, music, and math and science. So I guess 4. And at the beginning of my first residency, I gave a talk, as you do. It was an Aboriginal residency. And I said, I want to collaborate with mathematicians and science. And I said, I want to weave light. And I know this was over 10 years ago. So these ideas about, I'm giggling because weaving light would be so amazing. And that's what all the top scientists are trying to do, right? Curve light. So I did, well, anyway, so I said this, and I elaborated a little bit on, just the idea of moving, maybe it's a futuristic way of thinking about space, and our physical space, not outer space, our physical space, and how powerful light is, and how powerful weaving is. Anyway, some of the people who worked in the art center at the Banff, in the arts department of the Banff Center, came up to me and said, we can put you in touch with those scientists and mathematicians. They're here in residencies. So I was like, okay, great. So I had a mathematician from UC Berkeley come into my studio, and we just talked about math and the math that was present in the patterns. And it was a really, and she was studying oh gosh, a theory that was about pace. So like if you were going to run a marathon, like you're going to run a certain pace to make sure you get to the end. Or like if an animal, there's an animal in Chicago, an insect that I think comes out once every 7 years. And that's the only way that it can survive and not become extinct. And so we were talking about things like that. And then like all of the prime numbers that were repeated in the work. So I know that's not like a great answer to geometry, but I'm not a very like brilliant mathematician, but I do a lot of counting, and I do think about like odd numbers and even numbers and like stability, like the stability and the integrity of a thing and how numbers create integrity.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was such a cool way to bring math and art practices together. It's amazing. So we do at the Rail here have a tradition of closing out our events with a poetry reading. And I'm so excited to welcome Molly McGlennen to the stage. Molly is our poet laureate of the day and also one of my dear professors from Vassar. So it's really such an honor to have her here. Molly McGlennen was born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and is of Anishinaabe and European descent. She is an associate professor of English and Native American Studies and director of the American Studies program at Vassar College. She earned a PhD in Native American Studies from University of California, Davis, and an MFA in creative writing from Mills College. McGlennen is the author of Fried Fish and Flour Biscuits, published by Salt's Earthworks series of Indigenous writers, Our Bearings, published by the University of Arizona's Suntrack series, and the monograph Creative Alliances, the Transnational Designs of Indigenous Women's Poetry from the University of Oklahoma Press. Thank you for joining us, Molly. So excited to pass it over to you.
Oh, thanks, Eleanor. Eleanor is my favorite student.
Oh.
And if it was Eleanor's invitation and then the fact that Sarah was going to speak on her work, I could not resist this. It was such a joy to hear you talk about your work again, Sarah. And I forgot to mention that Sarah's work graces one of the covers of my books, the Transnational Alliances. So I get to look at her work all the time. And I teach her work in my classrooms all the time. And Eleanor can vouch for that I always say this is one of, if not the most, my favorite contemporary Native artists today. So
Thank you, Molly.
Absolutely, it's a joy. And so I know we both think about water a lot, and I was reminded that maybe the Mississippi binds us a little bit too. I'm at the beginning, you're at the tail end, maybe with your ancestors and with mine, being up from Minnesota. So I was just going to read a couple poems sort of inspired by Sarah's words. But this one had a cauldron of birch bark in it. The image of a cauldron made by birch bark, which is important to Anishinaabe people. So I'll read this one first because I was thinking about things made and left in our families. So this is to-do list before writing a poem. Recall the words we want her to teach. Nokomis, Nagizis, Zagaigan. Affix them to photos, the picture words imagined in blood. Trace the footprints of shadows, the way she washes her hair at night in lakes that have always bathed us. Children asleep, 4 to a room. Build the house again. Creak of floorboards. Birch bark cauldron to hold Menomen, a butter moon to say it's going to be fall. Feel her wrists and forearms ache, the years of rolling out biscuits and scrubbing screen doors, her days of cradling. Name the sons she's buried early. One's decay in the VA hospital, Agent Orange riddled. The other crashing to asphalt, atonement. Listen when she says, evince the scars, return. Okay. It's always interesting reading on Zoom. Okay, I'll read another kind of artist one. This is called Composition. I assemble with the hands of a poet who does not know the end of her poem. Ink is an afterthought. Piecing myself together, I use all the materials I can gather. Potter's clay and her acrylic paints, thick and thin camel hair brushes, a jump rope that tied my ankles, twine we use to hold the tomato plants. If I use food, it's mostly what I can recall. Wild rice and walleye, peeled oranges left for me in the morning, the crescent moon cashews she loves. If I need markers, I locate northern lakes, lilac bushes that guarded a backyard, overgrown and drooping with fragrance, the cotton blue bed sheets she'd drape on the line. I must sit patiently to do this, to place it all in order from memory. But will it matter if I can't quite get the smell, her hands as they tied ribbon round ends of my braids? Okay.
So beautiful.
Thank you. That's from my first book, Fried Fish and Flour Biscuits. I haven't read those in a while, so thanks for inspiring me to go crack that one open.
So beautiful. I love
And
it.
then Sarah, you'll like this, Artist in the Making. I opened this book, it was a copy of my second book, and then I saw this. This, my son must have been in there.
Oh, it's so cute.
So anyway, I have artwork, I guess, now in this book. This is I don't know if you know this artist, Frank Big Bear. This is
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, he's Anishinaabe from Minneapolis. Anyway, so okay. And I'm just looking at the time. So Eleanor, you just tell me whenever. Oh, I was really inspired about the maps. I can't wait to look more. I've studied a lot. I've actually written scholarly work on Sarah's work, mostly on the Cowgirls and Indians series. And I'm really inspired to wanting to go look at the Power Lines exhibit to get down there. So I was thinking a lot about mapping and the way Indigenous peoples have always mapped their sense of place, right, or conceptualize it and have known it, right, communally, and have thought about mapping in radically different ways that is abundantly informative, right? And so these mental maps or oral maps, right? And so this is just a poem. This is explicit about maps, but it is a way of mapping a place. This is called Bearings 4. When we were water, we joined as we needed, were protected, knew to come back round. When we were water, we were patient for rain and knew its arrival, forecasted by purple sky. When we were water, days worked in circles and years concentrically until we knew our beginnings. When we were water, we dove and scouted like loons, swallowed pebbles by night. When we were water, we turned into ourselves, leaving behind what was no longer essential. When we were water, we turned into ourselves, claimed by heart circles that have never washed away. Okay.
That is so incredible.
You're
So beautiful.
I'm just like, I'm just keep thinking of your work. There's a lot of time, there's a lot of synergy.
Yeah.
Okay, just maybe like 2 more. Is that good? 2 short ones? Okay, we'll do that. I just keep thinking about the water ones. Okay, so.
Do you have can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
In front of everybody? Do you have like visions and dreams? Like, are your poems and your writing, is it does it relate to like things that you see and like in very direct visions and dreams, or is that too personal of a question?
No, it's not too personal. I can't say it's dreams, yes. And mostly it's the auditory part of it. I can't quite say that I can see things fully, but it's what I'm hearing. You know, in dreams. And sometimes it's just waking up with lines or an idea, or maybe it is an image. Certainly. And then when I wrote this book, which was all me taking trips back, you talked a lot about traveling, but me taking trips back to home, several of them, now with 2 little kids, you know, with me, going to these places with my mom that we had, you know, visited, well, you know, maybe never went to or had gone to a lot around the Minneapolis area. I was really hearing things a lot. So for me, it was more in the ear, but then, you know, of course, seeing things anew somehow, having not lived there now for several, you know, a lot of years, but still understanding that place as really central to who I am and my identity and all my family being back there. So it was sort of like that. So maybe it's the musicality of poetry, and that's why that's the medium I'm sort of called to, because it's what I hear. And maybe you're more, well, I can't speak for you, but you know, it's interesting.
I see things. Yeah.
You see things. So yeah. Well, okay, I'll just end with this poem. How about that? On Fire 2. Breath guides the trail in, fuse, foot, and pine needle, ground as keel or compass, ancient foot traffic. This earth body could be calendar, forecast, indexed. Markers ahead, squint eyes, see ancestor dispatch. Spot lady's slipper, could be moccasin flower amongst tamarack. Another earth memo, wood for snowshoes, slender shape of white spruce cones open, season about to turn. Identify basswood, remember cradle boards or sawtooth leaves to run fingers along. Point to clearing, call back forest language as we look for traces of cut marks, tools, messages, signposts of tenure, or our family records. Thanks everybody for listening. It was such an honor to be part of Brooklyn Braille's great work that they're doing, and alongside, of course, Sarah Sense. And thanks, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Molly, for those gorgeous, warm, just perfect poems. I'm so excited. I'm basking in the conversation. And yeah, thank you to everybody who joined today. Thank you again so very much to Sarah and Yasmeen. We'd also like to thank Bruce and Christina and the extended team from Bruce Silverstein Gallery for helping with today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and for supporting our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. And please join us at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Sarah Magnetti and Chloe Stagaman on Monday on the event of Dovetails at Margot Samel, and we will conclude with poetry reading by Ariel Yellen. And you can now say hello and goodbye as you leave. We'll turn on the mics. Thank you everybody for joining today. Thanks for this wonderful Friday afternoon, and enjoy your weekends.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sarah.
Happy Friday, everyone.
Thank you, Yasmeen.
Happy Friday.
Be
Thank you.
Thank you so much.